Hey, it's Brent from the White Lab Workshop. Today I'm going to show you how I turned this old scrap oak from my grandfather's workshop into this beautiful keepsake box for my parents. Let's go have some fun.
This project has a lot of sentimental value for my parents, particularly my dad. After my grandfather passed away, my dad was cleaning out his shop and gave me these scrap oak chunks to burn up in the fire pit. As I showed in our tic-tac-toe game build video, I discovered that some of these chunks still have some potential. I started this project by choosing some workable pieces and cleaning them up on the table saw. This box was a gift I gave to my parents for Christmas this year, but I built it months ago. I wanted it to be a nice surprise, so I sat on this footage until I was able to give it to them. Once cleaned up, I resawed a few pieces to make the sides a little thinner. I did this by raising the blade just over half the height, then flipping it over and putting a wedge in for the second pass to keep the two sides from pinching on the blade once released. Then I glued them up using clamps and cawls. While that dried, I got to work on a jig for cutting splines in the box. I used some 1/2-inch MDF that I had handy and cut some wings and a base. I then cut some 45-degree supports and put some miters on the wings. With all the parts cut, it was time to glue them together to make a functional jig. Keeping my multitasking on point, I got back to work on the sides of the box while the jig dried up. I cut them to length with the crosscut sled on the table saw, then I cleaned them up with a random orbital sander. I then tipped the blade to 45 degrees again and cut miters on the ends. For the bottom, I put the blade back to 90 degrees and ran the sides through to cut dados. It took a couple of passes through to make room for the 1/4 inch plywood that made up the bottom. The lid is a number of scraps that I milled up to 3/4 of an inch thick, so I glued them together. Then I cut it to length. When cutting the lid to width, I wanted to take a little off either side to make it a little more uniform. Time to assemble the box. I used the painter's tape trick to keep everything aligned nicely. If you're enjoying this video, consider subscribing to the channel and joining us on this woodworking journey. I kept it simple with the lid and cut some rabbets along the bottom perimeter to give it a slightly loose fit onto the box. It was time to make things a little more interesting. I put one of the outer blades from my dado stack on the saw to get a nice flat curve bottom. Then I put my new spline jig to use and cut 2 splines on each corner of the box. I used my crosscut sled to cut some splines to match the 1/8 inch kerf of my blade. And a bit of glue to put those splines in place. I'd opted to leave the tape in place all the way through to the glue up, hoping to keep the glue cleanup down to a minimum. The drawback of that was that little bits of the tape got into the glued up joint and I ended up having to sand it out anyway. Since this was before I had a flush cut handsaw, I used a coarse grit sandpaper to sand the splines down enough to pull out the random orbital sander with some finer grit. After cleaning up the splines, I noticed there were some small gaps from the splines not being perfectly bottomed out in the slot. So I mixed up some glue and sawdust to fill them in. A little touch-up sanding and this is the result. I used medium walnut Danish oil for the finish. That brought out the grain nicely. Overall, I'm actually amazed at how well this project came together. I wasn't even sure it was going to work when I started, but look at this beauty. Being able to take discarded scraps from my grandfather's workshop and turn them into a beautiful keepsake box for my dad was really cool. Let me know what you think of this one in the comments below, and maybe hit that thumbs up button if you like what you saw. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.